Welcome to Venture in the South. These are the stories of innovation and success in the southern U.S. that make money, have fun, and do good.
Welcome back to Venture in the South, a podcast about angel investing in the southeastern United States. On this week's episode, we are going to talk about the SSBCI program. It's a subject we've mentioned in the past but have not delved into in detail. So in this week's episode, David's going to ask me some questions about what the SSBCI program is all about. And then I'm going to turn around and ask some questions of a practitioner or a deployer of the capital that has come from the SSBCI program. So to kick things off, David, welcome back. It's funny for me to be welcoming you to the show, I guess, but welcome. Good to be back together, doing a show together. Fire away with your questions.
Well, thank you, Paul. The video segment has been your baby, and so that's part of the reason why I'm sort of being welcomed in. So thank you for that. So let me just ask you a few questions about the SSBCI program, just to give listeners an idea of what this is all about, because it's a little bit complicated. So just in terms of the program in general, tell us what it is.
Yeah, sure. So SSBCI stands for State Small Business Credit Initiative. None of those words are obviously related to early stage angel investing. So I'll try to explain how that gets from credit for small businesses to investing in startups. The basic idea of this program is the federal government wanted to find a way to put more money into small businesses, particularly in areas or particularly for entrepreneurs that didn't have easy access to it. So there was an initial attempt, SSBCI version 1.0, probably 15 years ago, that did some of that. And then there was a kind of relaunching of the program with some more recent legislation in the prior administration to do SSBCI 2.0. And the 2.0 part is a $10 billion allocation of federal funds to the states, and then the states can go do with it what they want within the parameters of this program. And the parameters essentially are get this money into the hands of small businesses in their state. And there are two main ways they do that. One is the version 1.0 way, which was a variety of sort of credit-focused things. So bank loan guarantees, collateral support, loan participation programs, and other things that actually get credit in the hands, usually through banks or associated with banks in some way, into the hands of small business. But somewhat innovatively, this version 2.0 program has an allocation that's specifically aimed at equity investing into small businesses, and including technology-based startups like we would traditionally think about sort of angel and venture capital investing. So kind of a new piece to a established model there to help funnel funds from the federal government through the state allocators into startups and small businesses. There's about $3 billion that has gone into that equity-focused piece in this program. So that's what we're talking about here.
Okay. And so just parenthetically here, is there a risk this is going to get clawed back by the new administration in terms of DOGE activity?
You would think so. You think that's a risk? Yep. Obviously, it's a relatively small amount. It's small businesses, which all traditionally have been a Republican constituency rather than a Democrat one. But who knows? I mean, everything is on the block. I don't think there's been any indication yet that it is imminently in the crosshairs, but it should be if everything else is.
Okay, and then the starting gun fired in August of 2022. So you're a couple years in. What is the story to date?
Yeah, this program's been going on for a little while at this point, but almost nobody has heard of it. And one of the questions I get asked frequently is, do I know anybody in South Carolina that's actually received the money? And the answer is yes, but there's not many. So we'll talk about how that has come to pass. So within the venture capital side of the equation, the money for equity investments, there are two basic models that each state uses. Well, actually, let's go one step further. First of all, they divided that $10 million up between all the states. I'm not exactly sure how, like related to population, I think, but I'm not entirely sure how they did that. But however they did it, South Carolina got $100 million. North Carolina got $200 million. California got more. Some Indian tribes got less as well. They were involved in the program. There were various little carve-outs for educational programs and some other complexities as well. But the long and short of it, as South Carolina, as an example, got $100 billion, South Carolina decided that half of that was going to go into the traditional 1.0 credit backing things, and $50 million was going to go into venture capital in some way.
Okay.
Then there are a couple of different ways that money can get into the hands of entrepreneurs. One is some kind of allocator funds those directly. And that is mostly the model that South Carolina's come up with. There's one entity here called InvestSC that is deploying that money directly into startups. The other model is that an allocator puts money into existing or new venture capital funds, and then those funds put the money in the hands of the startups. And that is mostly the model that North Carolina has used. They had an entity called the NC Rural Center, and their mandate was to go find some funds to put that money into, and those funds would go invest it for them. So far, I think it's fair to say North Carolina has beaten South Carolina as two examples about how effective that program is. But each different state has a different flavor or combination of those. Tennessee is mostly fund of fund with a small allocation to direct investing. Georgia, it went through an entity called Invest Georgia. Virginia, I think, is a bit of both as well. So it's a variety of them. And obviously, that's not a straightforward process. You can't flick your fingers overnight and suddenly you've deployed all that money into the right places. There's obviously, as you would expect with a government program, a fair amount of bureaucracy and regulation to deal with. So a lot of people have been learning how to do that over time. So it's taken a while to deploy the capital, but the capital is starting to flow where it's supposed to be at this point.
And then what about the leverage angle?
Yeah, so this money is not just meant to be a one-off kind of single source of capital. The idea behind it is that you leverage it in some way, not in the sense that you borrow against it, but in the sense that $1 of this SSBCI money catalyzes or in some way encourages matching funds from private investors in two ways. One, at the time that investment is made. So within a fund context, for example, if the SSBCI puts in $10 million, the fund has to find another $10 million, at least a one-to-one kind of leverage to match that. Then there's a wider goal that eventually the $10 million of SSBCI funding is leveraged 10 to 1 by other private capital or other money coming in subsequent investment rounds or other debt coming in subsequent investment rounds. So that over time, the leverage is 10x what the original $10 billion was.
That seems pretty optimistic.
Yeah, it is a lot. Obviously, it depends on how you calculate things. So if a company does get big and then goes and raises, $100 million Series A, then and you put in $1 million in the seed round, then you've got 100 to 1 leverage right there. So that kind of stuff is what we're talking about.
Denominator.
Yeah, you cast a wide net on how these companies do in the end and count all the capital that comes in, which is that's the goal. So it's how you get there and whether it happens or not in practice, I think is unclear. But that's the goal is to use this money not just as a one-off like random thing, but to catalyze an ongoing ecosystem of investing or funding these kinds of companies.
Okay, that makes sense.
That's what the leverage is all about.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's a whole bunch of other rules. One of the challenges with this program is there are 50-something different stewards of the money, and all the rules in all the states are different. So it's quite hard if you're a fund manager or an entrepreneur to figure out what the rules are in your jurisdiction, or even who it is that has the money in your jurisdiction. And so I'm telling people in South Carolina all the time who it is that they need to go talk to because they don't know yet.
Yeah. Okay, well, talk a little bit about what kind of companies qualify for this money.
Yeah. So on the debt credit side, it's established businesses that can support some kind of debt in the same way that the SBA and others, lend money through banks to established companies. On the equity side, it is small businesses, but as it's equity investing, it also encompasses early stage startups. So it can be exactly the kinds of companies that we at Venture South or Rolling South invest in, early stage technology-based startups. It's state specific or jurisdiction specific. So the South Carolina money is supposed to go to South Carolina startups. But beyond that, it's any of the companies that make a compelling case that they should receive those funds.
So let me ask you,
Yeah.
Let me clarify this. by using two examples. One, a local company like Boyd Cycling, which is not a traditional tech company, but is they have cash flow and they would be a small business type thing. And then you have a tech company like, say, Gradient Health, which is a data purveyor, and they have revenue but not profit. And so contrast the program for those two types of companies.
Yeah, so everything is a continuum. So I would probably argue that Boyd was a tech company because underneath their established business, they are a carbon fiber technology manufacturing company. So everything's a bit of a continuum. Both of them, though, would fit in this program. Both of them could take equity on the equity side, I think. Boyd could potentially, as it's a bit more established and cash flowing, could probably take debt too if they could convince the allocators on the debt side to do something. So they would both be eligible, I think, for this program. Obviously, Gradient's in North Carolina, so they would go there. Boyd's in South Carolina, so they would go to their allocator here. But both would be able to, I think, get into the program.
Okay.
There are a bunch of other rules, of course, about who's eligible and who's not. So one of the particular goals of this program was to invest in what is the government calls SEDI companies, SEDI, not SETI, companies that have entrepreneurs or owners that are socially or economically disadvantaged. And that means basically, all the traditional groups you would think of, female founders and founders of color, ones you perhaps wouldn't necessarily think of, veterans, people that live in rural areas, people that live in census tracts that are labeled as poor. So it's a pretty wide net, but it's not everyone. And so there's obviously various views about how constitutional or morally justified that is. But one of the explicit goals of the program was to invest in SEDI-based individuals.
Now that would seem to be at risk from the current administration's war on DEI.
One would think so. Yes. Yes. It's not exclusively, impossible for a white male to get the money. It is obviously preferred that other people do. So It is, I think, unclear and nuanced, but it would appear to put it in the cross.
But it's entirely
I don't think I've
possible
seen any yet.
that the government could come in and say, we're not going to do that part of the program, but the rest of it's okay.
Possibly, yeah. That could be a path forward. But at the moment, I don't think there's any. I haven't seen any indication that they're thinking of changing the program. Nothing's been announced about it. The rules are certain groups are more eligible for this than others.
Yeah, in the context of Doge, these are pennies, and so not warranting attention anytime in the near future, most likely. Okay, so why should entrepreneurs care about this program?
Well, so entrepreneurs are always raising money. So this is a pot of capital that you may not be familiar with that is explicitly aimed at you. So entrepreneurs raising money in South Carolina should know about it to see if they fit the program and go pitch their startup to it. Or fund managers in places where they're using the fund of funds approach should know about it. And I think it may be too late now, but should have gone to pitch to the allocators in those places to go get an allocation. In South Carolina, they've got to deploy $50 million into venture capital style deals there's only, I think, 3-ish years left in the program nominally. They need to get a move on because that's a pretty big chunk of change to put in startups in South Carolina. And so I think there's an increasing urgency for startups to go pitch for it and the deployers to go get the money out there.
And so how do they identify the source to pitch to?
So Google it. There is it's pretty easy to find if you know about it. You wouldn't necessarily have Googled it had you not known about it. So hopefully this podcast episode gives a few people a little bit more of an insight that there is some money out there for you, or could be if you look for it.
So they would search online for the allocators that have been approved for this program in South Carolina, and then they would contact them directly.
Yeah, most of them have a contact us page on their website or submit your startup information here or whatever.
Right.
You can do it sort of the top down, so you can go to the federal government website, the Treasury Department's website, and follow down where the money went, or you can Google SSBCI South Carolina and Invest SE will show up as the place to go for that.
Okay.
But they aren't the only one. So not to air too much Venture South dirty laundry, but we were an allocator of that for a little while at Venture South. Our allocation has been removed, so we can't do that anymore. So it can be a little confusing. You might see some stuff about a Venture South fund allocation for this. We don't have that anymore. So it can be a bit more complicated, but you probably pick your way through once you start talking to people, figuring out where that money is.
Okay, and then why should investors care about this?
So on the investment side, if you're an emerging fund manager, you probably should have cared about this over the last couple of years because it may have helped you raise your fund. So that's part of it. If you're an individual angel investor and you're investing in startups, you also want to help your startups fully fund their rounds. So this should be on your list of people you might introduce them to if you want that round to be fully funded. So at Venture South, we're always telling people, have you looked at the 9 funds in North Carolina that could be matching our private capital? And in South Carolina, we're sending people to the relevant place there. So investors care about it because it's another potential capital source to fully fund their companies.
Yeah, syndication solution.
It's a syndication solution for sure. I would say that I'm not incredibly excited when companies take money from investors that could potentially be clawed back if they change the rules or comes with significant bureaucratic or reporting issues. So I have some concerns at this point when a company is raising money with SSBCI funds that may be necessary but not ideal.
Yeah.
So I just want people to, both sides, entrepreneurs and angels, to just be careful and aware that all money has strings attached to it. So I'm not saying they're necessarily bad, but just to be aware of what those strings are and proceed accordingly.
Yeah. Well, given the current fundraising environment we're in, there's so many desperate companies trying to raise money that I don't think there will be any shortage of applications through this program, regardless of the paperwork, red tape, and foibles of the program. But well noted.
Although, yeah, you could be right. Although I will say that the federal government is now trying to report how much money is actually being deployed. And as always, getting data is less ideal and less straightforward than you would think. But it seems like the traditional 1.0 debt credit deployment has gone smoothly and is essentially deploying at scale, at pace. But on the equity side, it's way behind a pro rata rating per year of what you'd expect.
Yeah.
So I would say there probably are no shortage of applicants, but there's still a bottleneck of getting that cash to the recipients for probably 10 different reasons. But it is proving hard to get that money out.
Yeah, deployment is the problem.
Patience required. Yeah, getting the money back again is always the problem at the end of the equation, but there's a particular challenge here of getting the money out in the first place.
Yeah.
And so, yeah. And I sympathize with it. It's not straightforward to make investments in startup companies, and it's not something governments are, typically equipped or expert at doing. So they set up their rules. Interpreting their rules as a practitioner in the space is hard. The rules change. There's these layers of the treasury bureaucrats versus the state allocation bureaucrats versus the fund managers or the startups, all of whom speak different languages and do different things. So making this all work is challenging.
Yeah.
But as we'll talk about in the second half of the show, when I talk with one practitioner, it is possible and it is being done. It's just a lot more painful than one might hope.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for that explanation. And we'll go to your interview with Dan Russell.
Welcome back to Venture in the South. In this week's episode, we're exploring the SSBCI program. And I wanted to take what we learned in the first half of the show and apply it to a tangible example in North Carolina. And so welcoming on the show, Dan Roselli, who is familiar with this program and also an experienced investor and entrepreneur in North Carolina. So benefit from his experience in a couple of ways. Dan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks, Paul.
Maybe to kick things off before we delve too far into the intricacies of the SSBCI, you can tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about your background to getting here.
Yeah, sure. So based in Charlotte, North Carolina, I kind of describe the work we're doing at RevTech Labs as the third phase of my professional career. First was doing big company marketing, General Mills, Colgate-Palmolive, M&M Mars. And in 2000, took a job with Bank of America, which is what got us to Charlotte. So I ran brand strategy, Marcom for Bank of America globally, ended up as a member of the management operating committee of the bank. It was a great opportunity early in my career to see how a Fortune 10 operating committee works and learn financial services and get us to the Southeast. So that was all great. But when it was time to leave the bank, all the jobs at that level were back in New York or maybe London or San Francisco. And Sarah Garces Brazelli, my wife and business partner, we'd fallen in love with the Carolinas and we wanted to raise our kids here. So the second phase of my career was as an entrepreneur, was one of the co-founders of Red Ventures, which is now a good-sized company, but obviously really small as we started it, and spun a company out after the first couple of years. I kind of had an entrepreneurial phase of my career, co-founded 3 different companies that made it on the Inc. 500 list, fastest growing private companies, so had some success there. And then about 15 years ago, started the third phase of my career, which is kind of building the tech and entrepreneurship ecosystem in Charlotte and the region, and then building it more nationally in the fintech and the insurtech space. That started with us in 2010, the great financial crisis, as I joked, to a crazy thing that only entrepreneurs would do. And we bought an empty downtown office building in Charlotte to turn into a tech and entrepreneurship center, and that's Packard Place. So many people may have heard of that. The brag stats on that community, $2.5 billion in venture capital raised, almost $800 million in exits, 100 jobs created, 3,000 entrepreneurial events held in the space. It's just been a game changer for the Charlotte region. Sarah and I ended up selling a majority stake of that in COVID. So there's lots of other good spaces there. And we focus almost all of our time on RevTech Labs and RevTech Labs Capital now.
Okay, got it. It's a pretty impressive list of feats there, and your brag stats are well deserved to be shared. Let's talk about the RevTech Labs, as that's the current thing that you're spending your time on. So what is that, just for people who are not familiar?
Yeah, so it's a accelerator, a lot like a Techstars. That's actually the model we modeled it after. But uniquely, we focus on fintech and insurtech only, really broad definition of that. But we're sitting in Charlotte, the second largest banking capital in the US. It made a lot of sense to do. So we launched that in 2012, really under the idea of where could we go compete, being based in Charlotte, and win on a national and international level. And that's why we chose to focus on fintech and insurtech. We were one of the very first, if not the first, fintech-specific accelerators in the country. So we're in class 22. We're just doing that program now. And just for order of magnitude, in 2024, almost 1,000 companies applied to the program from 35 different countries and 38 different states. And we took 25. So kind of hyper competitive to get into our program now.
Yeah, wow. And so on the brag stats there, how many companies over time have been through that, just approximately?
We're about 200, a little over 200. So
Okay.
we only do 2 cohorts a year, and
Yeah.
we'll only take a maximum of 15 companies. So the max we would take is 30. So it's always between 25 and 30 a year.
Okay, got it. And obviously, fintech and insurtech actually encompass quite a lot of different things. So are there any limitations or specialties, or is it really pretty all-encompassing within those fields?
It is all encompassing. Charlotte, being a banking town, is particularly good in compliance, regulatory tech. So that's always been a sweet spot for us. And then the core fintech areas, insurtech areas, you would expect, payments, capital markets, personal finance. We'll go as broad as cybersecurity because that does have such a big impact on everything in that marketplace. Anyone who's protecting PII, for example, would fit in that as well. Anyone who's making a market where there isn't one now. The only thing we would exclude that most people would define in that space would be crypto. We'll do crypto adjacent, but anyone who's coming to launch a coin and applies to our program is just not a good fit. We leave that up to the West Coast.
Okay. Yeah, okay, got it. And do you have sort of follow-on funding funds and other post-accelerator activities as part of the menu?
Yeah, so different organizations, right? RevTech Labs Foundation is a 501c3. That's what actually runs the accelerator now. And then RevTech Labs Capital, which is a for-profit, very traditional venture fund model. So those 2 organizations partner. RevTech Labs Capital will put money into every company that comes through the accelerator, and we'll look at follow-on funding as well. One of the real benefits in sequence, we did the building, then we did the accelerator, then some of the events that we do, and we can talk about that later if you want, and then RevTech Labs Capital. And why that sequence was important in terms of history and how it evolved is because we had the accelerator already established, it really allowed for a nice partnership with the funding side of the organization. And one of the things we talk about is we were doing, before the fund existed, probably 80% of the work of a venture fund without the opportunity to monetize it. So, for
Okay.
example, when the companies come in, we live with them for 12 weeks. You sit on their advisory boards, connect them with mentors, watch them go through the program. So we believe we get a level of due diligence on these companies for free as a byproduct of running a really great accelerator program. Probably more due diligence than you could do even if you were trying to acquire a company, right? Because if you live with the founder for 12 weeks, on both sides, you can't hide anything and you get kind of a truly authentic look at the company.
Yeah, got it. That's a much deeper level of diligence than I think most VCs could plausibly claim to do. So that's very cool. And I think that's then what brings us back to the SSBCI program then. So you are familiar with that from the RevTech capital side of things, right?
All right, that's right. We applied to and got a investment from the SSBCI version 2.0 program that's managed by the North Carolina Rural Center. The program title is NC Invest.
Okay, got it. Maybe just could you flesh out a little bit what it is in South Carolina, how much money's involved, and who gets to direct it, and where the money has been allocated to?
Absolutely. So at North Carolina, I think you said South Carolina, but
I'm sorry, yeah, North Carolina, yeah.
that's all right. They're Carolinas. It's all friendly. So the application we put in, we ended up getting an investment around $3.5 million, and that gets deployed in the companies that come through the accelerator. One of the things I think was particularly interesting from the Rural Center managing and why we were selected is we're the only fintech specific, venture fund in the Carolinas, and certainly it's a core vertical for us in the state. And so the ability to grow that community in the state, to pull people in from other states, kind of go on the offense, if you will, and pull people into the North Carolina ecosystem and really make this one of the epicenters for fintech innovation in the country and globally was part of the interest. We've also had some very nice performance, and we're fundraising, so I won't talk about that, but if anyone wants to have a conversation, they can certainly reach out.
Okay, got it. So the allocation of this funding in North Carolina was, I think, 200 million or so, and 30 of it, if I recall correctly, went into the VC bucket. Is that
It was
right?
a little more than that. I think it was around 35, and then there were some additional tranches that can be activated. Yeah, but it was a relatively small portion of the 200 million that came into the state of North Carolina. But still, very very thankful that it's there.
I mean, that's a
Decent chunk. And whenever you can get, I'll call them an institutional investor, right, based on the level of due diligence that went into the application and selection process, there's a credibility that I think comes with that as well. And we were one of the largest investments made. I think over 10 funds, it might not be 9 funds now, but one of the larger investments made. And I think that's a statement of support and belief in the thesis and the work that we're doing and the way we do it.
Okay, got it. And I think North Carolina was a little unusual in putting money towards, I think, exclusively towards fund investing rather than direct company investing. So that's an interesting approach they took. Do you know anything about why they just decided to take that approach?
It's interesting. In our first fund, we did get a little bit of money from the SSBCI version 1.0 that happened during the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. And I think the belief is that, a fund of funds program allows, and they really did focus on, activating either new fund managers or newer fund managers, right? This is only our second fund, so we're still considered an emerging fund manager. I mentioned Sarah earlier, we're one of the very few majority Latina-owned venture funds in the country, certainly in the fintech and insurtech space. And so I think part of that activation was important as well. And there really has been a focus on the SETI measurement, which is the federal government's definition of a societally and economically disadvantaged individuals. So it's not only some of the traditional things you would expect, like female founders or founders of color, but also founders that are in rural areas or economically disadvantaged areas, right? So a number of our founders come from tier 2 or tier 3 counties, and that's also an emphasis of the program. So it really is talking about how do you create a playing field where the very best innovation in America can come from, regardless of background, race, geography, or kind of economic disadvantage.
Okay, got it. And then the funding mechanism is it goes into your fund, right? So it has to be matched by other private capital, and it's treated like it's not a separate pool of capital or some kind of special allocation. It's just central to what you were already doing, kind of catalyzing what you were doing and expanding it a bit.
Yeah, that's right. They would use the word catalytic, as a matter of fact, that they want their investments to be catalytic in terms of the impact that it has in the state. So there is a private company match that has to happen in order to activate all the money. And their hope is, and the goal is over time, that they'll end up at a roughly 10-to-1 leverage or better in terms of their dollars versus all the private money that is raised in that company. So not just the round they come in, but the follow-on rounds that they believe that if they were part of making that happen, they can show that multiplier effect, if you will. But early money's hard, right? Which is why this fund to funds program was so important in the first place.
Okay, got it. But it doesn't change what you're allowed to invest in. I mean, there's maybe more attention paid to the SEDI characteristics and obviously the state characteristic as well. But it doesn't restrict what you can do in the accelerator or the fund, right?
Yeah, that's right. There are some very minor things that we wouldn't have been doing anyways, like you can't invest in marijuana finance, even if it's legal in the state, right? Would be one example. We weren't doing anything that they would exclude, we had already excluded. So in terms of a thesis, it was right. And I think that was part of the reason they invested. It was right in line with the same goals they had.
Okay, got it. And so did it catalyze and help on the fundraising, or was it a nice to have at the end?
Oh no, it absolutely was catalytic for us, right? Like I said, the credibility of going to private investors and say, hey, we got one of the largest investments from this very sophisticated state-run program, acted very much like an institutional investor. I don't want to say endorsement because it wasn't an official endorsement, but kind of show a support and investment, right? Definitely helped us. And we talked about it with investors. We also talked about the fact that their dollars were going to help us leverage that match and unlock more dollars. So they had a bigger impact by coming in. And that certainly helped us.
Okay, great. Well, congratulations on getting that.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess that's only part of the work. You then have to go deploy it. So how are you doing on the deployment side of the activity?
Well, it's been great so far. We deploy into our accelerator program as our primary investment channel, and that's been continuing to grow. I mentioned some of the stats earlier from 2024, and we're at the point now where we're so selective on the process that the people that come into our finals that don't end up in the class many times will come back around in following years and following cohorts. And sometimes it takes people a couple application attempts to kind of cross the bar and be able to come into the program. So when you take that kind of hyper selective process, and then we believe by them just coming through the accelerator, we're going to increase their probability of success. Matter of fact, that is the literal mission statement of RevTech Labs, which is increasing the probability of success for high growth founders. It is very hard. Everyone listening gets this to be a founder of a high growth company. The failure rate is extremely high. And even if you get the successful route, it's still, it takes a ton of tenacity from a founding team to get that done. And if we can make that job and that path just a little bit easier, we think that's really worthwhile work to do. And I'll give the plug that I always talk about with founders that, most of the net job creation in this country comes from companies 500 people and less in size. It is not coming from the Fortune 500 companies, as great as they are, and we're glad they're here, but they're not normally net job creators. They're normally net job shedders because they're trying to create efficiencies and increase profit margins. And the growth is really coming from these high growth companies driving the U.S. economy, creating job creation. I guess I should have said too, that's part of the other reason why I think the SSBCI program nationally is so important is I do think it's catalytic in helping job growth and drive the economy in our country. And then it's one of the most important things we could do, and maybe some of the most important work we could do.
Yeah, it does seem to be a useful instrument to get venture capital or risk tolerant capital into places that historically it hasn't been. So that definitely fits their mandate well. Okay, good. So you're deploying the capital pretty briskly then, it sounds like.
Absolutely. So the investment period for our fund is about 4 years, pretty traditional in that metrics. So it'll include all the companies coming through in 2025 as well, but it will be 150 to 170 companies in the portfolio. Also, because of that very different portfolio construction theory, if you will, right? Most venture funds make 10 to 12 investments, and we'll have hundreds. We think there's actually some positives in that, Paul, in the fact that, like most funds, the top 25% of our companies are going to do almost all the returns of the fund, and more than half will be out of business in 5 years. But the difference is, instead of having maybe one or one and a half or two companies that are driving the return in a fund, because if they hit a hiccup or a road bump, it can really damage the returns of a fund. Here, if that happens to us, it would be painful to lose one of our superstars, but it's not going to be the end of the return on the fund. because we just have we've kind of taken some sample size risk off the table based on the size of the portfolio and the number of companies coming through.
Yeah, got it. That comes with, I would guess, some compliance challenges. Or the whole program, I think, has some compliance challenges because reporting is substantial back to the Treasury Department right in the end. But also they ask for things that are perhaps not exactly what a traditional LP investor in a VC fund would ask for. So how do you cope with doing that and then also doing it for 200 companies and not 12?
Yeah, we had to develop some new strategies and methods, right? Kind of helpful. I think most people know my background and certainly heard it earlier in the show here. I didn't come from a venture background. That is good and bad. I didn't have the little unwritten rule book about how you're supposed to do it. So I did it in the way it was logical to me as an entrepreneur. And that's how we ended up where we are. We've had to develop ways of doing communication from one to many instead of one-on-one. The traditional model is you have a call probably every month or maybe every week with your portfolio company, right? And we couldn't possibly do that. So we do things like twice a year, we have an all hands call where we get all of our alumni on and we'll run through an agenda of these are the new partners that we've developed. Here's what's going to happen at our conferences. Here, even something as simple as these are all the applications for awards or grants coming up in the next 6 months. So we do a lot of the same work, but we have to communicate it in a different way. It's also kind of fun because we can do alumni reunions and we can get lots of folks at the 2 conferences that we do, coming back, and it's a bigger, broader community. The other thing, for a quick example, we have a founder resource sheet, which is just a Google sheet with a bunch of tabs at the bottom, but it talks about accounting firms and law firms and marketing firms, and the ability for our alumni to be able to refer other providers that have done great work for them and add value. That's a great learning ecosystem to have a community that broad that you probably wouldn't have if you had 10 companies.
Yeah, got it. No, I like that one-to-many communication. I'm interested in the other way around, how you get the many participants to give you the information you need to pass on back. How do you solve that problem? Or is that still a work in progress?
We do a quarterly survey because, again, we can't have a conversation with every single one every month. And so they do a survey for us. We try and keep it as simple as possible. We aggregate that. That's how we do our portfolio evaluation. We only mark when there's a third-party arm's length closed transaction. So we certainly pay attention to that. And we're, even with 150 companies, we're able to keep our finger on the pulse of that, because when, in a 150 portfolio, maybe 10 are raising in a quarter, but they all let us know
Yeah,
because they want to see
those are the ones that do report well. Yeah.
if we're going to invest, and now they make connections to others. Again, unique to us with portfolio size, we will not lead follow-on investments. Just too many children in the nest, right? And so we just developed that strategy early on, but we definitely will help them connect with the folks we have almost 400 venture firms on our co-investment roster now. Certainly help them connect with folks that we know will lead rounds and try and make that happen. So we try and be as helpful as we can.
I know it's hard to pick out favorites, but are there any companies that have been through the programs that people may have heard of if they're in the Carolinas, or that you'd like to highlight for some reason?
Yeah, there are a lot of companies, and most of them are not consumer-facing brands, right? We don't do a lot of B2C, so most of ours is B2B2C or B2B. One people probably heard of out of Atlanta, Trust Stamp, I think was in class 5. They're publicly listed on the NASDAQ. We've had several that have had strategic exits, which I thought was great for investors and shows that there's some market for these companies growing up. Most of our companies don't go on to be unicorns, right? That's not really what we're shooting for. But because we're early stage investors, someone having a $100 million exit is really meaningful back on the equity stake that we have. So, and if people want to check it out, the companies are listed on the RevTech Labs Capital site, so you can go check out our portfolio there as well. But probably too many to name by name.
Okay, great. Well, no, that's good. Usually we ask people how they can get in, or ask interviewees how potential companies can go get in touch with them. In your case, it's not quite such an open door. It's you need to be in the fintech or insurtech space. Do you accept applications though from companies all the time, or do you have a strict timetable and cadence where you want to engage with new potential
Our application
members?
is open almost all year round. Call it 9 months out of the 12. Part of the reason we do 2 cohorts is early on, we would meet some companies that weren't quite ready yet in terms of traction. And when we went back a year later, when we only had 1 cohort, they had passed the stage where an accelerator was really going to be beneficial for them. And as an entrepreneur, I'm like, well, that sucks. We're missing opportunities. So part of the reason we started doing 2 cohorts a year is I didn't want to miss out on great companies based on our timing vis-a-vis kind of their life cycle. But 2 cohorts, we can pretty much capture everyone we need through a cycle. As I mentioned, there's a number of folks that will apply, don't quite make the cut, make it to a final selection day, but don't quite make it into the program. But then within a couple of months, we can talk about the next cycle, and waiting 6 months to come in is not an eternity. And lots of times those companies can grow up a little bit, get some more metric, maybe a friends and family round, and come back into the program. And that's been useful for us as well.
Okay, got it. What do you think is the future for fintech and insurance tech in Charlotte, or are there other things in Charlotte that are catching up in terms of interesting investment opportunities around the region?
Yeah, well, on the positive, we made it probably 20 minutes into the discussion without mentioning it, but I'm going to have to do it now. I'm going to mention AI. It's impacting every investor segment across every vertical. It's impacting fintech and insurtech the same way. Probably 70% of the applicants in this last cohort mentioned AI in some way.
Can't
Maybe
believe it's
40,
not higher than 70. I don't know.
maybe
I mean, it's not
maybe
99. What are they
40%.
doing?
Yeah, maybe 40% actually we're doing something with AI. Anything that used to be with machine learning or LLM, right, is all now AI. I'm not sure it's all real AI, but it has impacted, right? And one of the counsel that I give to all of our founders, kind of like when blockchain became really big, probably 7 years ago, people will come and say, well, we're a blockchain company. I'm like, no, you're not. Blockchain's an underlying technology, right? You're a payments company utilizing blockchain to do something more efficient in the payment space. I think the same thing is true about AI. I mean, there are some, I guess, core AI companies, but we really counsel founders to say, hey, we're a capital markets play, using AI to find better commercial real estate opportunities, right? Or something like that. So that's certainly impacted it. But like I said earlier, we're very broad in our definition of fintech and insurtech. And because we've already become irrelevant or not allowed 95% of the founders in the world, and sometimes narrowing creates strength of brand and value proposition. But within that part, we do look for the very best founders we can find. And so we ended up being pretty broad in our definition of fintech and insurtech.
Okay, got it. Do you constantly look for new mentors and participants on the kind of educational side of the program, or have you have a roster that's pretty stable at this point?
We do. No, we are always encouraging new folks to come in, because some people will come in for a while and they'll change jobs or leave, so there's a natural attrition that happens. On the RevTech Labs site, there's a little button about applying to be a mentor. I'd encourage anyone listening that wants to do that, or just ping me on LinkedIn, whichever's easier for you, but would encourage people to do that. It's also interesting that some people that are, in big financial insurance companies that have never been a founder sometimes think they can't mentor or wouldn't be a good mentor. And that's couldn't be farther from the truth. We really do enjoy when folks can come in because they're subject matter experts, right? In capital markets or in payments, or the expertise that they can bring. We have a database of almost 500 active mentors now. And the reason we have such a broad database is you never know what you're going to need in each class. And that's really allowed us to meet a really diverse set of need states for the companies, because that database is so big. So please apply, consider it. The other thing we were talking earlier about, founders kind of connecting with us. Obviously, if they want to apply to the program, they can do that on the website as well. But if anyone, mentor or startup founder, wants to kind of jump into the ecosystem, I'd encourage them to come out to one of our events. We produce this event called FinTech and InsurTech Generations in June, the largest FinTech event in the Carolinas every year. And then in the fall, we do an event that you've attended in the past, Venture 135. All fintech and insurtechs, I think 50 Series A, Series B ready fintechs from around the country, 3 dozen venture firms. And that happens in November. So also a great opportunity to kind of come in. And I should mention, even if you don't come into our program, founders can apply to present at Venture 135. We never charge founders to apply. We never charge founders to present. I hate that model as a fellow founder, but a lot of the venture events that are out there make their money by charging the founders to get up on stage. So a couple of ways of engaging with us in the ecosystem.
Okay, great. Well, we'll make sure we have the links to all of those events in the show notes and publicize those for you. So thank you for flagging those too. And thank you for telling us a bit more about how the SSBCI program in particular works. I mean, a lot of people are still learning about that. I think people are mostly not familiar with it. I think the model in North Carolina seems to be a successful version of the implementation of that, at least more successful than some of the other states that I'm familiar with. So congratulations on being an instrumental part of that.
And I should say, thank you to the North Carolina Rural Center, who is the fund manager on that. They really have done an exceptional job in a very tough program because the rules sometimes change as you go, right? And so
Yeah, right.
I'm glad it exists, but it has not happened without a lot of hard work by a lot of really good people.
Yeah, great. Be interesting to see if it survives the uncertainty of other programs disappearing. So we'll see how that one goes. But good.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you for the invite. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening. Visit us at ventureinthesouth.com for a complete list of previous and future shows.